Welcome to the deep dive. Um, if you are joining us today, you are likely looking for a way to make sense of the deeply complex, often deeply frustrating mechanics of societal change.
Right.
We are taking a highly structured, analytical approach to a problem that usually generates a lot more heat than light. We are examining the source material from the 18th and final university workshop led by Professor Wu Jing.
And it is a genuinely profound piece of work. After spending weeks with his students meticulously designing what could be considered, an optimal mathematically sound democratic system, Professor Ying turns his attention to the most daunting question of all.
Yeah, the transition.
Exactly. It's one thing to design a perfect engine on paper. It's entirely another to swap it into a vehicle that is currently speeding down the highway.
Driven by individuals who have a vested interest in keeping the old, polluting engine running. So, the mission of this specific deep dive is to explore that exact transition. We're going to look at how a society can theoretically move from a deeply entrenched, corrupt autocracy to an optimal, functioning system, and doing so without resorting to armed, violent revolution.
Which is the key constraint here.
Right. Now, before we begin, it's crucial to note that the source material touches upon sensitive political realities and mentions specific political figures and historical events to illustrate its points. As always, we are here to impartially report and analyze the concepts contained in the original source material. We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoints, nor are we taking sides in any partisan disputes.
We're just looking at the architecture of his argument.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly to convey the structural and philosophical ideas Professor Honk presented to his participants. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah,
The professor begins by attacking a concept that is incredibly pervasive in stagnant political climates. It's the defeatist excuse that sounds something like, our people just have a bad mentality, therefore nothing can ever change.
Right.
If you live in a country struggling with institutional corruption, you have undoubtedly heard someone say this at a dinner party.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a very common defense mechanism for societies experiencing prolonged dysfunction.
Yeah.
The argument essentially claims that the citizenry inherently lacks the moral or intellectual capacity for a highly functional democracy. People look around at the rule-breaking, the bribery, the civic apathy, and they conclude that it must be a genetic or cultural flaw.
A built-in defect.
Exactly. But Professor Inca vehemently rejects this premise. He posits a clear, impermeable distinction between a social system and a mentality.
Okay, so define those in his terms.
Sure. In his framework, the social system represents the formal and informal rules of the game. So the Constitution, the laws, the institutional enforcement, and the consequences.
Right.
Mentality, on the other hand, is not a pre-existing condition. It's simply the predictable, calculated behavioral result of interacting with that specific system over time, combined, of course, with the residual trauma or survival lessons of the past.
Right, so he argues that what we perceive as a cultural flaw is often just a highly rational adaptation to a broken environment.
It's survival.
Survival, yeah. The source material uses the real-world example of the guest worker to illustrate this, which I think is fascinating.
It's a perfect test case.
Let's say you have a citizen who has lived their entire life in a politically dysfunctional country. In this country, rules are viewed as mere suggestions. Corruption is the only reliable way to get administrative tasks done.
You pay the bribe or you wait forever.
Exactly. And traffic laws are routinely ignored because the police can just be paid off. Then, this individual packs their bags and moves to a highly regulated environment with strict enforcement.
Like Germany, for example.
Right, like Germany.
And what happens next is crucial to dismantling that bad mentality myth. That individual does not undergo a sudden spiritual transformation at the border crossing.
They don't suddenly become a different person.
Right. They're deeply held internal values, which psychologists generally agree are formed in the first 6 to 10 years of life. Those haven't fundamentally changed.
No.
Yet their outward behavior changes almost instantly. They do not throw trash on the pristine sidewalks. They certainly do not park their car in a fire protection zone.
The Bronchit zone.
Yes, because they quickly learn that doing so carries an immediate, non-negotiable financial penalty. A 500-mark fine, as the older example goes.
So the system dictates the behavior, not the inherent morality of the driver. The rules are clear, the enforcement is absolute, and the human being,
who is highly adaptable.
right, an incredibly adaptable creature. They instantly calculate that compliance is the only logical path.
Exactly.
And the proof that their underlying values haven't fundamentally altered overnight is what happens when they return. When that same guest worker returns to their home country for the summer holidays, they often revert to their old behaviors within hours.
Instant.
They drive aggressively, they bend the rules. Why? Because the environmental system has changed back to one that rewards or tolerates that behavior.
It's all about the rules of the game. To deepen this point about how group mentality is formed, perpetuated, and eventually divorced from the original rules, the professor utilizes a famous psychological analogy involving 5 monkeys in a cage.
I love this analogy.
It's very illustrative. In this setup, a bunch of bananas is hung from the ceiling, with a ladder placed underneath. Naturally, a monkey climbs the ladder to get the food.
Because it's a monkey and there are bananas.
Right. But the moment it touches the bananas, the researchers spray all the monkeys with freezing cold water and deliver a mild electric shock.
To all of them.
To the whole group. Eventually, another monkey tries. The exact same thing happens. Cold water, electric shock to the collective. Very quickly, the monkeys learn the unwritten rule of the system.
Reaching for the bananas brings pain.
Collective pain. So they stop trying.
Okay, so the system has successfully altered their behavior.
Yes. But here is where the formation of what we call mentality becomes visible. The researchers replace one of the original monkeys with a new one.
A fresh arrival.
Right. The new monkey, ignorant of the history, sees the bananas and immediately heads for the ladder. But before it can even reach the first rung, the other 4 monkeys grab it and beat it severely.
Wow. I mean, they're protecting themselves.
Exactly. They know the consequence of the system, and they are enforcing the rule to prevent the shock.
So the monkeys have effectively instituted their own neighborhood watch, and the only rule is no bananas.
Precisely. And then the researchers replace a second monkey. The new arrival goes for the ladder and is beaten by the group.
As expected.
But what is fascinating, and honestly a bit terrifying, is that the first replacement monkey participates in the beating, despite never having experienced the cold water or the shock itself.
It just learned the required behavior from the collective.
Right. This process continues until all 5 original monkeys have been replaced.
So you're left with a cage of 5 monkeys who have never once been sprayed with cold water or shocked.
Never. Yet if a new monkey is introduced and reaches for the bananas, they will violently prevent it. If you could somehow ask them why they do it, their answer would effectively be, I don't know, that's just the way things are done around here.
That is mentality in a nutshell.
It is. It's a society passing down unwritten rules, fears, and survival mechanisms long after the original punisher or the original systemic condition is gone.
It's a really profound way to look at societal trauma. If you're listening to this and reflecting on your own local history, it explains why citizens in post-authoritarian or post-conflict regions maintain a culture of silence.
Or a deep distrust of institutions.
Right, long after the actual dictators have fallen. The legacy of fear operates completely independently of the formal rules until a new system has been in place long enough to override that inherited memory.
And the timeline for that override is quite specific in Professor Yang's model. He notes that while outward behavior changes immediately when the formal rules change, just like the guest worker avoiding the parking fine,
Right.
true mentality takes roughly 3 generations to fully align with a new system.
Let's explore that timeline, because it really grounds this theory in reality. He maps it out across roughly 60 years.
Yeah, 3 generations.
The first generation, the adults who experience the regime change, they alter their behavior to survive the new rules. They follow the new laws, but internally they still harbor the old values and discuss the old ways in private.
They are compliant, but not converted.
Exactly. Then you have the second generation, their children. They grow up observing this subtle discrepancy.
Right. They see their parents acting one way in public to comply with the new system, but hearing a different set of values or fears at the dinner table.
This generation adapts much more fluidly to the new world, but there's still a lingering cognitive dissonance. They carry a shadow of the old mentality.
Because of their parents?
Yeah. It is only the third generation, the grandchildren, who grow up in an environment where what they see in public perfectly matches the values they're taught in private. For them, the new system is the only reality they have ever known.
A picture and the sound finally match.
Therefore, the professor argues, if a society implements a perfect, unshakable constitutional system today, it will take until roughly the year 2085 for the deeply held values of the population to fully and organically align with it.
It's a long game.
But you cannot wait for the mentality to change before changing the system. That is the track. The system must change first to initiate that 60-year generational clock.
Which brings us to the urgent need for that first step. Professor Ekshink offers a surgical critique of the current system in these stagnant societies, explaining exactly why the prevailing authoritarian, pyramidal power structures are fundamentally flawed and require dismantling.
So let's talk about that pyramid. If the system is so demonstrably bad for the population, why is it so sticky? How does it survive?
He breaks down the anatomy of autocracy to answer that. In a pyramidal system, decision-making is entirely centralized.
Right.
One person or a tiny oligarchy at the top decides, the next layer benefits, the subsequent layers transmit the pressure downward, and the vast majority at the base bears the weight.
Standard autocracy.
Yes. Now, the professor acknowledges a very uncomfortable truth about this structure, something that often confuses outside observers. Autocracies possess an illusion of extreme efficiency.
Right, because if an autocrat decides the country needs a new bridge, a railway, or a massive infrastructure project to boost their image, it just gets built fast.
Exactly.
There's no bureaucratic friction, no tedious public consultation, no environmental impact reviews that hold up the process for a decade like you might see in a mature democracy.
The central authority points a finger and the concrete is poured.
Yeah.
However, he draws a sharp, vital distinction between being efficient and being effective.
That's an important distinction.
Autocracies are highly efficient at executing short-term, highly visible tasks. But they are disastrously ineffective at long-term strategy.
Because there's no feedback loop.
None. There's no independent media to point out flaws and no mechanism for constructive dissent from lower ranks. So they very efficiently execute the wrong priorities.
They build the bridge to nowhere.
Precisely. They invest billions in the wrong industries because the leader had a whim. Furthermore, the system is intensely inflexible. Because everything is tied to the apex of the pyramid, any change in leadership causes massive destabilization throughout the entire structure.
He describes the nature of power within this system as distinctly feudal.
Yes, feudal.
We often think of modern states operating on market logic, or at least some semblance of meritocracy. But in a centralized autocracy, the unwritten rules resemble the courts of 11th century kings.
The relationships are based on suzerain and vassal loyalty.
Right.
It's an economy of favors and personal allegiances, masquerading as a modern bureaucracy. You know exactly who your patron is above you.
The person who protects you and grants you resources.
Exactly. And you know exactly who your vassals are below you, the people who owe you fealty. Proximity to the ultimate leader is the primary currency of power.
This inherently corrupts the distribution of resources. It's profoundly unjust because it serves only a narrow caste at the top. Competence is actually viewed as a threat.
Loyalty is the only metric that matters.
And the ultimate consequence of this, as the professor outlines, is a slow, quiet, demographic catastrophe. When citizens eventually realize they cannot change the system from within.
When they feel trapped in a feudal structure where hard work means nothing and loyalty to the ruling party means everything.
Right. They enact the only protest left available to them. They vote with their feet.
Mass emigration.
It's the silent hemorrhage of an autocratic state. The educated, the young, the skilled laborers, the ambitious, they simply leave for countries where the social system is already functional.
They choose to become the guest workers we discussed earlier.
Adapting to a foreign system rather than waiting 60 years for their own country to normalize.
Which drains the stagnant country of the very human capital it needs to ever rebuild.
Further cementing the power of the autocrats who remain behind to rule over an increasingly dependent and impoverished base.
It's a vicious cycle.
So the diagnosis is mathematically bleak, the pyramid is rigged, it efficiently executes terrible ideas, and the brightest minds are just leaving.
Yes.
So how do you dismantle a pyramid without the whole thing collapsing on top of you? This is where the workshop shifts from sociology to methodology.
Through addition plan.
How do we actually install a new constitution, a new formal system, without resorting to violence? Because the professor notes that the public has zero appetite for armed revolution.
And historically, violent revolutions often just replace one autocrat with another anyway.
Exactly. This is where Professor Ayank's background becomes highly relevant. He approaches this not as a politician relying on charisma or ideology, but as an engineer.
He utilizes a methodology similar to two tries.
Two-rise-y.
Right. Two-rise-y is the Russian acronym for the theory of inventive problem solving. It's typically used in hard sciences and engineering.
How does that apply to a political revolution?
It involves defining the ideal final state of a system, perfection, and then methodically working backwards step by step to the present reality, identifying the exact resources needed and the contradictions present at every single stage.
Reverse engineering a bloodless revolution.
Exactly.
It sounds almost like science fiction when you first hear it, applying industrial engineering to human societies. But the logical chain he builds is incredibly grounded.
It really is.
Let's walk through the steps he laid out for his students, starting from the very end. Step 1. The ideal end goal is a stable, prosperous society operating under the new mathematically optimal constitution they spent weeks designing.
But for that society to be stable, we move backward to step 2. The new system must be fully adopted and practiced by the population. It cannot just be an abstract academic paper.
It must be positive law.
Right.
Wait, before we move to step 3, let's define positive law for a second for anyone not steeped in legal theory. You mean it can't just be a theoretical guideline or a gentleman's agreement?
No, it has to be codified, actionable legislation that the courts actively enforce.
Precisely. It must be the undeniable law of the land, written down and universally applied.
Which brings us to step 3.
Okay.
For the system to become positive law, it must be officially established. And because this involves the fundamental rules of the state, the very Constitution itself, it cannot merely be passed by a temporary parliamentary majority.
Because they might just lose power in the next election cycle.
Right, and then the next government undoes it. It must be ratified directly by the people through a constitutional referendum.
And crucially, it must be packaged with the necessary systemic laws like the federal budget mechanisms and electoral rules, so the old guard cannot quietly undo it later through administrative loopholes.
That packaging is essential.
Okay, moving backward to step 4. How does a binding national referendum actually happen? A referendum must be officially called by the parliament. It requires a qualified majority of representatives to vote in favor of holding the public vote. Let's clarify qualified majority as well. We are not just talking about 50% plus 1.
No. Depending on the current constitution of this hypothetical state, calling a referendum of this magnitude usually requires a 2/3 supermajority in the parliament.
Which brings us to the brutal reality of step 5. The ultimate bottleneck. How do you get a 2/3 majority in an autocratic, pyramidal system to vote for a referendum that will end their reign?
That's the core problem. The representatives in an autocratic parliament do not vote based on their conscience or the will of their constituents.
They are vassals.
They vote based on the explicit instructions of their party leadership. Therefore, the leaders of the corrupt ruling parties must explicitly order their representatives to push the green button and allow the referendum to happen. This raises an important question. How do you force an entrenched, wealthy, powerful ruling elite to voluntarily order a vote that is explicitly designed to dismantle their absolute power?
It sounds like an insurmountable paradox. You're asking why a king would ever vote to abolish the monarchy.
Exactly.
To solve this, the professor introduces a highly controversial but purely pragmatic political roadmap. He looks to a very specific historical parallel to prove that an entrenched ruling party can indeed be forced into calling a referendum that goes against its own long-term interests.
Yeah, and that parallel is Nigel Farage and the Brexit strategy in the United Kingdom.
Right, and it is vital for us to separate the policy from the tactic here. The professor is not endorsing Brexit. In fact, the source material notes his view that it was a deeply detrimental decision for the UK's economy and standing.
Oh, absolutely. However, as an engineer analyzing a system, he isolates the sheer strategic brilliance of how that structural shift was achieved.
Right. Nigel Farage led a small, highly focused, single-issue political movement called UKIP.
Farage did not have a broad, comprehensive manifesto. He didn't have detailed policies on healthcare reform, education, or transport.
He had one singular, relentless demand: a referendum on leaving the European Union.
And here is the kicker. UKIP never came close to winning a general election.
But they didn't need to.
No, they didn't. They captured a critical minority of voters, enough to threaten the dominant Conservative Party's electoral margins.
So if you are listening and wondering how a tiny party changes a nation, think about the math of a parliamentary system.
It's all about the margins.
If a fringe party takes even 5 to 10% of your voter base, you can lose your majority entirely to your main rival. David Cameron, the prime minister at the time, was forced into a corner.
To secure his own government's survival and prevent his right-wing voters from defecting to UKIP, he had to trade a massive concession.
He promised to hold the Brexit referendum, firmly believing he would win it and put the UKIP threat to bed permanently.
Of course, Cameron lost the referendum, and the massive structural shift occurred.
Professor Iank translates this exact mechanism to his proposed roadmap for our hypothetical autocracy. He suggests the creation of a small, hyper-focused political movement. For the sake of the exercise, let's call it Focus on Total Democracy, or FTD.
FTD. The sole objective of the FTD movement is to enter the national parliament, capturing roughly 5 to 10% of the vote over 1 or 2 election cycles.
That is the target.
That's it. They do not run on complex ideological platforms. They do not engage in the usual political theater of promising higher pensions, debating foreign policy, or arguing about taxes.
They campaign entirely, exclusively on the promise of changing the constitutional system. They are a single-issue wedge.
And here is where this strategy requires immense, almost superhuman discipline. The professor outlines the most crucial and perhaps most counterintuitive rule for this movement.
This is the hard part.
They must strictly refuse all executive power.
Wait, I need to pause here because this is where the theory rubs up against human nature. You form a political party, you fight tooth and nail to get into parliament, and then you refuse power.
Yes.
The entire point of politics, especially in these stagnant systems, is to get a seat at the table so you can direct resources.
It is deeply counterintuitive, but it is the core of the leverage. If you take a ministerial position, you become part of the system.
You become responsible for the broken healthcare system or the failing economy.
Exactly. And the autocrat can blame you for the government's failures. You lose your outsider purity.
Right.
By refusing the spoils of the system, the FTD maintains total independence. Instead of taking ministries, they offer their crucial block of swing votes to a major ruling party to help them form a minority government.
The FTD leadership essentially says, we will give you the votes you need to stay in power, to control the budget, to keep your prime minister in the office. The price for our support is exactly one concession.
You must call a binding national referendum on our new constitution.
It's a calculated wedge strategy. The autocratic ruling party, faced with the prospect of losing executive control entirely to their traditional rivals, will act out of short-term self-preservation.
They will choose to retain power today.
Assuming they can simply manipulate the public, use their state media, and use their wealth to vote against the new constitution during the referendum tomorrow.
Just like David Cameron thought he could win the Brexit vote.
Precisely. You are using the autocrats' arrogance and short-term survival instinct against them.
But getting the elite to the negotiating table requires more than just parliamentary pressure. If an authoritarian regime feels it is facing total annihilation, if they believe losing the referendum means going to prison, they will fight back.
And they will use the state's monopoly on violence.
Yes. They will utilize the police, the military, and the courts to crush the reform movement.
Therefore, the reformers must offer what the professor calls an exit ramp.
Which leads us to the grand bargain.
Okay, this is where I think a lot of listeners are going to feel a deep sense of friction. The grand bargain is an incredibly difficult concept for citizens to accept because it requires prioritizing structural peace over historical justice.
It does.
When transitioning from a deeply corrupt system, the natural, completely understandable public impulse is retribution. Citizens want to see corrupt politicians jailed, their assets seized, and decades of injustice rectified. They want the people who stole their future to pay.
It is a deeply human desire.
Yeah.
But the professor warns, speaking purely as an engineer of systems, that if you promise a purge, the elite will never, ever agree to the transition.
They'll burn the country down to protect themselves.
Exactly. To avoid this, the grand bargain demands drawing a firm, unyielding line in the sand. The new system will explicitly not seek retroactive vengeance.
Hang on, you're telling me that the architect of this broken system, the politicians who have enriched themselves while the hospitals crumbled, get to walk away with millions in stolen funds just to keep the peace?
It's a proposal.
People are going to hate that. If you're listening right now, you probably hate that. It feels like letting the villain win.
It is a bitter pill. Professor Hank explicitly states that there can be no mass purges, no endless historical reckonings, and no revolutionary tribunals.
He uses the phrase, no 6th of October tribunals, referencing the day after a historical regime change when score settling typically begins.
In this pragmatic model, a massive threshold is set. Unless someone's corruption exceeds an astronomical figure, say tens of millions of euros, the absolute worst of the worst.
Past transgressions are essentially granted a clean slate.
From the exact moment the new constitution becomes active, the new draconian anti-corruption rules apply, but everything before day zero is amnestied.
The ethical compromise there is staggering. During the workshop, the source material notes that it was evident this feels deeply unjust to the average person who has suffered under the regime.
It's framed as a mathematical necessity.
You are trading the emotional satisfaction of punishing a few corrupt leaders for the permanent structural salvation of the entire country. You are buying the future by forgiving the past.
And to further solidify this exit ramp, to make it genuinely irresistible to a greedy elite, the professor outlines the secondary pillar of the bargain, a massive financial incentive. Under the newly designed Constitution, the official legal salaries for top politicians, ministers, and state officials would be drastically increased.
We are not talking about a modest cost of living adjustment. We are talking about salaries that are exponentially higher than average wages.
The logic here is brilliant in its sheer cynicism. You are replacing the elite's illegal, corrupt revenue streams with a highly luxurious, perfectly legal income.
You remove the immediate economic panic that drives politicians to steal in the first place.
Think about it. In many corrupt systems, a minister's official salary is relatively low, so they feel forced to take bribes just to maintain the lifestyle expected of their position.
This system changes the math. They are given a choice. Accept the new transparent system, stop stealing, and live a life of legally guaranteed luxury. Or reject it, fight the transition, and risk losing absolutely everything, including your freedom, if the system collapses violently.
Given that choice, the self-interest of the elite will guide them toward the safe exit ramp. They will accept the new rules provided they can maintain their status.
It's an application of structural engineering to human greed.
If you cannot make people inherently moral, and history suggests you cannot, you design a system where their greed is best served by compliance with the public good.
They get rich legally, and the public gets a functioning state.
Exactly.
So we have the blueprint, we have the parliamentary wedge strategy, and we have the grand bargain to prevent a civil war. Which brings us to the final and perhaps the most arduous phase of the workshop, organizing the movement to actually pull this off.
Because none of this works without execution.
Professor Inch issues a profound challenge to his students. Having a perfect constitutional blueprint and a mathematically sound political strategy is utterly useless without execution on the ground.
To achieve this peaceful revolution, the reformers must organize what he terms good people. But they must organize them with the exact same ruthless efficiency, dedication, and operational discipline as the corrupt elite they are trying to replace.
Right now, the autocratic system works tirelessly, 365 days a year, to maintain power. They have patronage networks, media control, infinite funding.
The reformers cannot be part-time hobbyists who protest on weekends. They must be hyperactive, organized, and ubiquitous.
And this requires a massive shift in how intellectual or reformist movements usually operate. They must step completely out of their comfortable upper-middle-class echo chambers.
They cannot just debate theory on university campuses or write long posts on social media and expect the country to change.
The expert execution of this plan requires grueling, unglamorous grassroots engagement.
During the workshop, a participant brought up a vital point regarding this exact type of outreach. They noted the absolute necessity of going door to door, specifically having students and volunteers politely engage with citizens in marginalized, rural, or traditionally opposing communities.
The reformers have to travel to the remote villages and the neglected outer suburbs, the exact places where the autocratic regime usually secures its base through fear and minor handouts.
And the approach has to be deeply respectful, which is often a failing of intellectual movements.
A university student from the capital city goes to a rural farmer, not to lecture them about high-minded democratic ideals, but to explain exactly how the new system benefits them personally.
For instance, explaining how the new, unshakable tax code will protect their agricultural yield.
Or how the new constitutional laws will ensure their local village school is funded, rather than the money disappearing into a minister's pocket. It's about translating high-level constitutional theory into tangible, kitchen-table economics for every single demographic.
And this outreach is bound by strict, almost militaristic rules of engagement. The reformers must maintain absolute message discipline.
They must never attack political opponents by name.
If the conversation turns to the current autocratic leader, the volunteer must politely redirect it. They must never get drawn into manufactured culture wars, debates over historical grievances, or foreign policy alignments.
Because the ruling party will try to bait them into these arguments to divide their potential voter base.
The discipline is to blame every single societal issue strictly on the flawed constitutional system.
If the local hospital is falling apart, the volunteer explains that it's not because the current health minister is uniquely evil. It is because the pyramidal system is designed to misallocate funds.
This keeps the focus entirely on the solution rather than the personalities.
This is crucial because it diffuses the defensive reactions of voters who might currently support the ruling party out of a sense of tribal loyalty. You aren't attacking their tribe, you're offering a better set of rules for everyone.
The ultimate hurdle they face on the ground, however, is overcoming the deep, calcified cynicism of the public.
There is a local phrase referenced in the workshop, dismount Kurta to mount Murta.
It essentially means overthrowing one corrupt boss just to replace him with a new corrupt boss.
The public has been burned so many times, they assume all politicians are the same, and that the reformers just want their turn to steal from the treasury.
It captures the exhaustion of a society that has seen revolutions fail.
The only way the FTD movement can prove they are genuinely different is by referencing that core rule we discussed earlier, refusing the saddle entirely.
When faced with that deep-seated cynicism on a doorstep, the volunteer looks the voter in the eye and says, "We do not want executive power. We will never accept a minister's chair. We are not replacing the rider. We are abolishing the saddle so that you can never be ridden again."
It is a remarkably powerful message, but delivering it to millions of people requires financing, media strategy, and a relentless ground game.
The professor suggests leveraging alternative media, podcasts, social media forums, and local networks to bypass state-controlled television. It requires organizing resources, both financial and human, with the precision of a multinational corporation.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed from the psychological myth of a genetically flawed mentality through the rigid, feudal realities of an autocratic pyramid to a highly pragmatic, almost Machiavellian blueprint for bloodless constitutional reform.
That's a lot to take in.
It is easy to look at the political landscape wherever you are in the world and feel a crushing sense of stagnation.
It is very easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of systemic corruption. But the perspective shift offered here by Professor Onk is vital. Treating societal change not as an emotional moral crusade of good versus evil, but as a structural engineering problem, offers a highly tangible, logical path forward.
It removes the despair and replaces it with a sequence of actionable steps. You don't need to change everyone's mind overnight. You don't need to incite violence or wait for a savior.
You need a dedicated, highly disciplined minority to leverage the mathematical vulnerabilities of a parliamentary system to secure a referendum and to offer an exit ramp that the powerful simply cannot refuse.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to reconsider what we actually demand from our democracies. We spend so much energy, so much emotional bandwidth, trying to find and elect the perfect, incorruptible leader.
A savior figure who will magically fix everything through sheer force of virtue and moral clarity.
But I'll leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the professor's engineering approach. What if the ultimate measure of a mature, enduring society isn't its ability to elect perfectly moral people to power?
What if the true test of a nation is its ability to design a constitutional system so mathematically sound and logically unshakable that even deeply flawed, self-interested, greedy people are structurally forced to act in the best interest of the public?
It fundamentally shifts the burden of progress. It shifts it from the impossible task of finding perfectly good people to the entirely achievable task of building good systems.
And systems, unlike human nature, can always be re-engineered.